Okay, so I'm going to work off what my colleague, who is not here, so that's fine. I was here 3 days ago. Maybe he has. Does he have another session? Or is he just standing me up? In any case, he talks about beauty and the Christian imagination. I'm going to talk about what the Christian imagination looks like, the challenges for it in a secular age. So the Christian imagination should be something that's eternal, that doesn't change with time, that its needs, characteristics have that characteristic, but that they extend. But we do have a special time. We do live in a specific kind of era. And I think that it causes some challenges for us as we're trying to teach students to be imaginative, as we're trying to be imaginative ourselves, as we're trying to create works, imaginative works. And so that's what I want to explore today. What happens when you live in a secular age? What happens to the Christian imagination? Are there challenges to it? And what I'm going to argue is that secularism closes us off, not entirely, but it threatens to what I want to call are the richest ways of imagining. And it does this by making it a private compartmentalized activity, which we subject to the scales of productivity. So let's begin by establishing terms. What are we even talking about? And I do want to, throughout this talk, I do want to think in terms of teachers. I do want to think in terms of practitioners, so poets, and authors, and other kinds of artists. And then readers. Your imagination is important as you watch films and read books. And so these questions, these challenges are going to be pertinent no matter what role you have as a teacher, as a student, as a reader, as an author, as a poet. Let's start by the secular age. What do I mean by secular age? So I'm just stealing from a great man, Charles Taylor, French-Canadian Catholic philosopher who wrote A Secular Age. And in it, this is what he describes. I don't know about you guys, but when I was growing up in the church, secular meant something like those people, those heathens over there, right? So like the good guys, and then there's the secular people over there. We've got to watch out for them. They're going to creep. Insidious people with their art that will trap you and manipulate you and con you into, whatever the chick tract said. Charles Taylor offers just a different understanding of secular. And one of the things that when I first read this book affected me the most was that the fact that his argument was that we're all changed by this secular age, whether the church suffers from this as well as everyone else. And that sort of changed the game for me as I understood this concept. So he tries to describe the secular age that we're living in as a time in which, instead of Christianity being, for those in the West, the belief system that virtually everyone had, it is one belief system among many, and he calls it increasingly one of the less plausible to believe in. That's the experience of it. This is a world of contested belief. To understand this, I think you've got to think about the Middle Ages. So if you imagine me being born in England in 1200, okay, I would be born to Christian parents, almost certainly. I would be baptized in the church. I would grow up in the church. I would be buried a Christian. Now that actually pretty much describes me, except the buried part. I'm still alive. I was born to Christian parents. I've been raised in the church, and Lord willing, I will die in the church. So what's different? The difference is that the medieval Alan never knew anything different. The medieval Alan never had his faith contested, at least not in the same way. I have always known I don't have to be a Christian. I've always known that there are other beliefs that I could adopt. My experience of faith has always been contested, and it will always be contested, because that's the kind of world we live in, and that is distinct, that is different. So this is what he means by contested beliefs. Everybody is living in this space where all beliefs are contested. There's always this tension, this anxiety, this feeling that you have to defend your belief and watch out for other beliefs because everything is being challenged. Now, along with this, he describes what he calls the imminent frame. He says, all of us live in what we experience as the imminent frame. And if you've heard me talk about this, I apologize. I only have one example of this, and I just reuse it over and over, and that is the example of rainbows, because I think it's very useful. So by the imminent frame, he means a material understanding of reality. And he says, look, whether you believe in a transcendent God or not, you experience the world through an imminent frame. So I always imagine, I visualize a picture frame, right? This is how I see everything through this frame. Now, he says some of us have what he calls the open imminent frame. So we believe in God, we believe there's something out there, but our day-to-day experience is still a materialist experience. So again, let me give you this example of a rainbow. If you see a rainbow, it's supposed to rain this afternoon, maybe we'll see a rainbow. What do you do when you see a rainbow? So I think you've got three options. I think the first thing we tend to do when we see a rainbow is we elbow somebody next to us and say, look, there is this beautiful rainbow. The second option is we take a photograph of it on our phone, we'll post it to Instagram and say, hey, look, everybody, here's a rainbow. The third possibility is maybe we think the scientific explanation of what a rainbow is. And I think it's something about light and water. I'm not entirely sure. That's homeschool. %. Homeschooling is the best. I'm sure my mom actually taught me this. I was just not a very good student. But so we think about maybe the scientific explanation. Now, if I were to go to this person, a hypothetical me or a member of my church, and say to them, in a different context, and say, do you believe that the rainbow is a sign from God that he will not flood the earth again? Do you believe that? I don't think many of them would pause and say, yeah. I remember learning this myself on a felt board construction in Sunday school. It's a little rainbow thing. It's very nice. There's a little gnome and there's the little ark. So conceptually, as an evangelical, I would say, oh, yes, I believe this is a sign from God. But when I experience a rainbow, I want to say it's highly unlikely that I actually experience it as a sign from God. So my lived experience is entirely material. If I want to remember that it's a sign from God, I probably have to work against the grain. I've got to work pretty hard to remember, oh, that's right. And why is that? Because we live in this contested space. The rest of society does not accept that the rainbow is a sign from God. So it's difficult for us to have that in the forefront of our minds. This is just how we live. So we live in this imminent frame. And this is going to be important for how we exercise our imagination. When we imagine things, are they limited to things only within the imminent frame? That's going to become a challenge. Third, he describes an idea called, and he's getting this from Robert Bella and a number of other scholars in a book called Habits of the Heart, called expressive individualism. All right, so if we used to have an identity grounded in an eternal God out there, and that is no longer there, or at the very least, for those of us who do have faith, it's highly contested. It's highly contested. How do you know who you are? How do you know who you are? I always like to point to Dante. Dante is a great example. I always tell my students that the crisis that Dante has is not an identity crisis. This is an important distinction. He does not have an identity crisis. He has a spiritual crisis. Dante, when he's lost in the woods, knows exactly who he is. He just doesn't know how to get back on the road. And his challenge is, how do I get to the sun at the top of that hill? And he has to go through hell, the infernal and purgatory to get there. But he knows who he is. He knows who Dante is. Contemporary people have identity crises. We have identity crises. And in fact, many of us have perpetual identity crises. And we just constantly evolving, rebranding ourselves, and sometimes in that very language of branding. So what happens is, in order to feel ourselves having some ground, we have to define ourselves. And in defining ourselves, we have to express ourselves. In fact, those things go hand in hand. If you know who you are and you don't express it, you probably don't know who you are. So we're constantly, in other words, signaling to everyone around us what we believe, who we are, what we represent, what we're about. The fourth thing is the collapse of shared values, except for efficiency. Now here I'm relying a little bit on Taylor, but I'm also looking at another Canadian, Calvin Searville, a Dutch Reformed theologian, and Jacques Ellul, a French sociologist. We talk about the way technology rises as secularism rises. More specifically, our dependence upon efficiency rises as secularism rises. And this sort of makes sense. Look, if God is the one holding up the universe and defining who you are, you can rest. There is a Sabbath rest, and it makes sense. If there is no God, then you have to hold up your identity. You have to hold up, in fact, the whole world. And so we might not be able to agree on questions of morality, but we can agree on questions of efficiency and productivity. And as a result, modern life is increasingly taken over by a drive for efficiency, be more productive. We feel this acutely when, Myers, earlier this morning, he talked about that experience of going out and seeing the moon, his classmates seeing the moon, and being overwhelmed with the reality of God's presence in the world. That kind of contemplation and awareness of the natural world and its connection to God can only happen if you're not overwhelmed with the desire to be productive. But if you feel guilty every time you stop doing something, then you're really not going to be able to be aware of God's creation. So these four characteristics, contested beliefs, the imminent frame, expressive individualism, and the collapse of shared values except efficiency. Look, we can't agree on what is moral and immoral, but we can agree on numbers. And so if something is cheaper or more efficient, then, well, it's numbers. There it is. All right, what do I mean by Christian imagination? This is a challenging talk because I knew writing it that there's volumes of books written on just this idea, and I'm just going to be talking out of my own head, let's say. So I'm sure I'm getting this wrong, but here's what I have in mind when I'm thinking about a Christian imagination. I'm thinking of an openness to the fundamental elusiveness, with an A, elusiveness of nature, the fundamental elusiveness of nature of creation, the fundamentally elusive nature of creation. An openness to the fundamentally, I'm just going to keep reading until I read it right. An openness to the fundamentally elusive nature of creation, which is always inviting us further up and further in. Now here I'm just taking from, again, Calvin Searville, who argues that a Christian aesthetic is one of allusion. It's one of allusion. To imagine is to use our God-given power of wonder to follow rabbit trails. Rabbit trails. One of my children at the academy is reading Alice in Wonderland, and I was thinking, following the rabbit. Why is it that we dislike rabbit trails? It has a purely negative connotation. Well, this is a rabbit trail. We feel guilty when we go on rabbit trails. Why is that? Well, because it's not a very efficient use of time. That's the problem. Don't go on rabbit trails. We need to stick to the path. Stick to what you're supposed to do. Don't go into wonder. Stay away from it. But to use imagination, to imagine is to use our God-given power of wonder to follow rabbit trails into reality in creation, and also the wonder that is illuminated by artists. So it's not just the physical world, God's creation, it's also the wonder, the elusiveness that we find in human created arts and their creative works. The activity of imagining involves a receptivity, so you're going to receive, a willingness to receive the excess of creation, to the relatedness of the world made by God, to the meanings all around us. A key here is it's unmasterable. To desire to use your imagination is to accept that you can't master something, that there's always going to be more, always going to be more. There's an excess of meaning. So I think about a tree, right? So you look at a tree, and it invites you to wonder about maybe the changing seasons. This is the work of allusion, pointing elsewhere. Maybe it makes you think of time, depending on what kind of tree. If it's an oak tree, it makes you think of long stretches of time, your own mortality. Okay? Maybe it makes you think of the greenness of green, or birds' homes. Or maybe it makes you think of the cross, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of life, or the film tree of life, or climbing trees as a child, or a poem, John Berryman, Dream Song #1. Once in a sycamore, I was glad all at the top, and I sang. Or maybe you think of Eliot, four quartets, and the yew tree. But there's always more. It's always pointing beyond, always pointing beyond. That's the Christian imagination, I want to say. And that can happen in a world created and sustained by a transcendent, loving, personal God. Okay? So this is not, in other words, the endless deferral of postmodernism where there is no presence at the end. It's just, we're just running on a treadmill. We're never getting anywhere. There actually is a being, the being. Okay? Okay, so those are our terms, those are our ideas. What are our challenges then? So I want to say that we have come to see imagination primarily as a private act, an individual activity, something for us, something that happens in my mind, for my pleasure, for my enjoyment. When we imagine, we don't owe anyone anything. It's a private game that we play. It comes from nowhere and it goes nowhere. It is largely a pleasant extension of our human capacity to think about counterfactuals. What if the world wasn't this way? What would that be like? It's an exercise of our brains to imagine what if. What if I lived in the Star Wars universe? But it's always an option. This is important. It's always an option, and it's always private. It's always private. We cannot be called by any authority outside of us to attend. If this is the way we think about imagination, we cannot be called upon to attend to something. So no authority, God or beauty, creation. But we can be seduced. That still happens. Ads will still seduce us with things, to imagine certain things. Right? Plenty of works can seduce us, but they can't have moral demands upon us. They can manipulate us using tricks of psychology, but they cannot make moral or spiritual demands on us. If you consider imagination to be an activity of entertaining the fictional or the aesthetically rendered, then our culture is probably the most imaginative culture of all time. Now, I've just given a definition earlier at the beginning of this talk, the Christian imagination, where a very different understanding of imagination. But let's say you do think of it this way. Let's say, and I do think that predominantly society, we do tend to think of imagination as the activity of entertaining the fictional or aesthetically rendered. And if that's the definition, we have millions of fictional worlds we can enter into. Not only film and television, although there are those, and video games and novels and poems, but there are entire online communities where the distinctions between role-playing and character and being yourself, your true self, between starting a quest and, let's say, joining a radical political movement, shrinks and shrinks. The distinctions between those things shrink and shrink. In other words, our imaginative spaces include the traditional forms, the novel, the poem, the play. It includes film, television, music. But I think it also encompasses these online communities, online spaces, and certainly trickles out into the world. In these worlds, what are we doing? We're primarily expressing our identity. We build our own alternative world. And this is key. We get to populate the world. Whether the alternate world is a carefully crafted character we build into a video game or a carefully crafted character we build for the quote-unquote real world, who do I want to present myself as? How do I want people to perceive me? Right? The point is that this use of imagination is fundamentally about us. The imagination is for me. It's a tool that I use to get pleasure out of life, or to feel a sense of belonging, or identity, or purpose. It's about me. It's a means of expressing myself, of getting out of the drag of daily life, of leaving this world, escaping it sometimes. It's always optional, and it's always centered in my head. By optional, I mean that we do not have to receive, attend to, or respond to these imaginative worlds, whether it's a film or a novel or a poem. We get to pick and choose the stories we engage. Now, of course, you can be shamed into receiving certain things. Sometimes this will happen. What you haven't seen, it's WandaVision, everybody's talking about that. I have not seen that yet. There's this sort of social guilt, the fear of missing out. You can be shamed into these sorts of things, but it's always a choice. We decide how long we're going to play in these worlds, and we are not required to take anything out of them. This is important, I think. We're not required to take anything out of them to apply to our world. This is a pleasant way to pass time. This story is a pleasant way to pass time. So I don't need to allow the world of the poem or the novel or the film to change me, to transform me, to convict me. I'm buffered. Charles Taylor would say that this is an example of a buffered self. I get to separate myself from this thing. I can play in it, but it doesn't have to change the real me. We use imagination to leave creation as creation, and therefore we leave our obligations to our neighbors and our dependence upon God. I think we also limit imagination to tiny, contained spaces. I said we compartmentalize. I'm going to unpack that right here. We limit imagination to tiny, contained spaces. One of the most pleasant parts about being a parent is that you discover that for children, being imaginative is normative. It's normative, at least at first. There are not, for young children, perfectly sealed moments where we have make-believe and then we have the rest of the world, the rest of experience. It's all mixed up for them. So when I tell my daughter, okay, it's time for dinner, and she's playing school because she enjoys the academy. And so this was just yesterday. She was playing school. She was playing school. So she's on the couch and she's playing school. Okay, well, it's time to eat dinner. For her, she doesn't step out of that world of make-believe. In fact, she conscripts me into it, right? She said, you either got to be a student or a teacher, Dad. These are your options. But you're in this world. She doesn't stop imagining when it's dinner time. Driving in the car can be an imaginative experience for her. Playing, my oldest, Nora, for her, playing with, I remember distinctly when she was 3, we buy her, she'd have dolls, but crayons, sticks that she'd find in the front yard would become entire families. Entire families. Seeing sticks of certain lengths was elusive to her and connected to the family structure and gave her all of these ideas. And so she would play for a long time. Everything could be imaginative. Children often think of imagination as the normative activity. Even in the way they eat. I mean, sometimes look at what this chip looks like. This looks like an elephant, Dad. You see this, right? Look at the way, the color of this leaf, Dad. I regularly get told I have to get up and go look at something outside, and then it's a red leaf. Cool, that's great. That's great. Yeah. Because their minds are imaginative, and so they see the meaning behind that leaf. Or put this flower in your hair, Dad. That was also yesterday. They're always making connections. I don't have hair, so it's always different, it just falls off. Always making connections. They're always seeing excess, always finding new ways of going further up and further in. But it isn't always like this. It comes to an end for most of us. It's not that way for all children, of course. Some are trained out of it very young. And even the ones who aren't, it doesn't tend to last. Because, why? Because we commodify, package, brand, contain, and isolate the imaginative. We create spaces and moments of time where imagination is applicable and socially acceptable, and then we we contain it. We contain it. We cut it off from its transcendent source so that there is an end to the illusions. Typically, it ends where the franchise ends, the film franchise or whatever brand it is. So there are times and spaces that it's acceptable to be imaginative. So let's say a movie theater or any screen can be used as an imaginative space in some sense. But these are highly guided experiences. I want you to note that. These are highly guided experiences. They're not ones where illusions carry the person along. You're taken by the hand. They do not invite us to imagine more. I think they create a desire for more content. You ever done this? So you get to the end of a good TV series, and you think, man, I'm ready for season 2. But it's not that you're invited to imagine more. It's not that your mind is racing with possibilities. It's just that you want more content. And there's nothing wrong. I mean, if it's a good show, that's great. But it's not the same use of imagination. We want spin-off shows. We want the sequels or another series. But they don't invite us. The art doesn't invite us to explore beyond that. Mostly because these works lack excess. They lack excess. And I think it's probably because excess is unproductive. After the film is over, you must get back to the real world. My kids have screen time, usually maybe 30 minutes a day, right? So screen time. All right, that's it. Okay, now you got to get back to your chores. Get back to the real world. Get things done. You got to get things done. Being imaginative in this sense takes a lesser kind of receptivity. So you have to be open. I'm going to say, even though these are not great works, and we do have to be receptive. If you want to watch, for example, The Mandalorian and get any pleasure out of it, you have to suspend your disbelief. But if you do, you can get some enjoyment. But it's not the same kind of receptivity that you'll get in reading a great work of literature. It doesn't demand that you open yourself up to as much. It doesn't demand very much from you at all. It tends to be very contained in the brand. Now, I worry that when this is the case, that we don't get to exercise receptivity very often. We don't get to exercise openness very often. The openness to the wonder of creation, to the possibility of growth and change and sanctification. And once it's over, once the show is over, once the book is over, once the series is over, the song is over, we can stop being receptive. Okay? We can stop being receptive. So here's that containing, compartmentalizing. Now I am open to the wonders of existence. I'm actually just open to the world of this film, or this show, or this book, or this poem. And now I'm going back to the real world, and I'm closing off that receptivity. I don't need it anymore. I'll take that out later. And so you watch something, you read something, and then you decide, I'm going to go for a run outside. And when I'm running outside, I don't need to be receptive to the natural world, to creation, to the beauty of God's created world, because that's not what I'm doing right now. I'm running. In fact, if I'm very receptive to it, if I'm paying attention to God's creation, probably not going to get a good run in. It's not very effective. I better just keep that in a box. Now I'm being imaginative. Now I'm being productive. The space for wonder was back there at home. It ended. These self-contained moments of what if tend to relieve us of the burden of life rather than extended experiences of the elusiveness of reality that illuminates life, which is what we really want to be working towards. Extended experiences of elusiveness. And you've felt this. You've seen a movie, and or you've read a book or heard a song, and afterward it haunts you. That's how I always feel. It haunts you. There are some that you can walk away from and you think, well, that was fun. And that's it. But there are some that haunt you, that get under your skin, that bother you, disturb you, upset you, challenge you, and change you. All right, so what can we do? All right, so this is what I'm saying, certainly not for everyone, but I am saying for a great many people, our students, our readers, ourselves, maybe what we are challenged by as we're trying to exercise imagination in a secular age. So what can we do? Well, the first thing I think is we need to practice, model, and invite others to conceive of imagination as an act in communion. In other words, it's not primarily, and it's certainly not exclusively about you. It's not about you having a good time. It's about you being called by creation and God into wisdom. One of my favorite novels, Franny and Zooey. My students, no, okay, yeah, we just read it anyway. In it, Zooey, we didn't get to talk about this in class, guys, so I'm going to talk about it now. Okay, in this great novel, Zooey is talking to his sister Franny, who's having a mental breakdown, and he's staring out the window, and he sees this little girl who is playing with her dog. She's got a dachshund, and she's hiding from the dachshund. She hides behind this tree, and the dog freaks out and is frantic, right? Where's my owner? Where's my owner? Then she steps out from behind the tree, and the dog just has this incredible sense of joy. Now, these characters, Zooey and Franny Glass, are pretty depressed about life. They're not sure where to take joy in life. And when he sees that, this is what he says. He says to his sister, there are nice things in the world. I mean, nice things. We're all such morons to get sidetracked. Always, always, always referring everything that happens right back to our lousy little egos. And I do think that is a problem with imagination, referring everything back to our own little egos. The reality is there are really nice things in the world, but we have to be receptive to them. That's what Zooey's pointing out. We're morons. We get sidetracked. We refuse to be receptive to the beauty around us. So what does this look like practically? Well, I think attending to details for teachers, for all of us, I think attending to details, attending to little things, giving them honor and respect. So for me, teaching literature, that means looking at words, looking at specific words and going through lines very carefully. That's a way of honoring the author and the text, but it's also a way of being receptive to it, of slowing down and being receptive to it. It means allowing time for wonder. We need to invite attention, carefully unbusied, prodigal attention. The imaginative activity draws us out of ourselves into greater awareness of creation and God. It calls us along the hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses towards Christ. We need to be receptive. Now, let me read a poem from Sylvia Plath called Black Brook and Rainy Weather. This is an example of receptivity. This is an example of someone being struck by creation itself. But it's a text written in a secular age. And what we're going to find is that the speaker is uncomfortable with what she sees. She's uncomfortable with the natural world calling her imagination and saying, listen to me, think about what this means, because she's not a person of faith, and this is difficult. On the stiff twig up there hunches a wet black rook, arranging and rearranging its feathers in the rain. I do not expect a miracle or an accident to set the sight on fire in my eye, nor seek any more in the desultory weather some design, some cosmic design, some design by a creator. But let spotted leaves fall as they fall, without ceremony or portent. It's a purely naturalist world. Although I admit I desire occasionally, so many commas in this section, some backtalk from the mute sky. Sometimes she kind of wants to hear from God through the natural world, through his creation. But then she says, I can't honestly complain. A certain minor light may still gleam incandescent out of kitchen table or chair, as if a celestial burning took possession of the most obtuse objects now and then, thus hollowing an interval otherwise inconsequent. By bestowing largesse, honor, one might say love. Maybe what we have instead is the human created world, the kitchen table or the chair. Sometimes even these boring things, there seems something other. There seems something elusive, I would call it. At any rate, I now walk wary. That's an interesting word. When I'm wary, it's like, I don't want to step in dog or something. I'm walking wary. That's the first thing that came to my mind. I didn't write that down. It's not in this, okay? This is what happens. This is what happens when you don't write everything out, like Dr. Myers does. She says, I walk wary, which has this negative connotation, for it could happen even in this dull, ruinous landscape. We are in Eliot's wasteland, okay? This dull, ruinous landscape, this boring modern world of concretes. Skeptical, right? This is her posture. She's skeptical. I don't believe in miracles. Yet politic, ignorant of whatever angel may choose to flare suddenly at my elbow. I only know that a rook ordering its black feathers can so shine as to seize my senses, haul my eyelids up, and grant a brief respite from fear of total neutrality. I don't really believe in miracles. I don't really understand. But here's the only thing I do know, that every once in a while, I will encounter something in the natural world that holds my eyelids up, that forces my senses to be receptive to elusivity, to creation. And what that does for her is miraculous, because it gives her a brief respite, just a breath from total neutrality. What is total neutrality? It's ruled in the imminent frame, where everything is the same. There is no hierarchy. There is no greater meaning or purpose. There's no lesser meaning or purpose. There just is. It's a world denatured, with nothing sacred. She doesn't like that world, but this is the world that she lives in. Except for every once in a while. It'll happen. With luck, trekking stubborn through this season of fatigue, which I take her to mean life itself, I shall patch together a contented sorts. Miracles occur, if you care to call those spasmodic tricks of radiance miracles. One of my favorite phrases, and probably one of the most tragic phrases for me. If you care to call those spasmodic tricks of radiance miracles. There's something going on in your brain, but man, it means something. The wait's begun again, the long wait for the angel for that rare, random descent. And now we think of David and the 104th Psalm. He sendeth the springs into the valleys which run among the hills. By them the fowls of the air have their habitation, which sing among the branches. David is also having his eyelids hauled open, his senses awakened by God's creation, and that is calling him into the world, not to leave it. It's not an escape. This is important. A Christian imagination is not an escape properly done. But it does call him up toward God. So the question becomes, do we allow our senses to be seized? Do we even want our eyelids to be hauled up? What Plath knew was that external calling is a miracle that defied neutrality. The world is not a material reality void of any meaning. The universe is not neutral. A voice speaks from the sky. And I think we can invite our students, our readers, into this kind of a space by modeling it ourselves. We should create stories that do not take us from creation, but reveal creation more fully. Not escape, but inscape. Create stories with wonder around every corner, rather than only where it has the greatest emotional impact. As teachers, I think this means in asking questions, inviting rabbit trails that are richly elusive. But it also means equipping students with the cultural context to understand the richness of older texts. One of my lessons in my life is teaching our Western Civ course, where I get to teach my students through the Aeneid and through Beowulf and through Dante and Milton and Hamlet and Frankenstein. And when I get to Frankenstein and the monster is lamenting and he is imagining himself as both Adam and as Satan in Paradise Lost, my students can see that illusion. And I can remind them that the monster's decision to damn himself and to go to war against all humanity is very similar to Satan's decision not to repent, but to be pitted against humanity, which is also similar to Hamlet's uncle. And he realizes that prayer he has where he thinks, maybe I could get forgiveness, maybe God could forgive me. And then he thinks, but then I would have to give up this kingdom. And so he damns himself. That's it. This is what I'm going to do. And both the monster in Frankenstein and Satan experience this same exclusion and desire to be a part of a warm community of love that Grendel feels outside of the mead hall, and it drives him mad. And so you can point students back and back and back, always alluding, always finding richness, always more. But again, it does require that we teach them this cultural context because it's in the texts, but they need that framework. They need that framework. Children are imaginative, but they need the cultural framework. We need it. I said one of my blessings is teaching this course, and part of it is because I get to read the same books over and over and over and over again. And every time I read them, there's something new comes out. Something new. There's always more if it's a great work of literature. All right. Now I want to talk about the so that is sort of addressing the imminent frame aspects of the challenge, I think, of imagination. But there's also this this question of efficiency, and I think we need to push back against efforts to contain wonder. Allow yourself space to reflect. Invite students and readers to wander everywhere. Teach them unhurried reflection. For teachers, this requires actually quite a bit of humility because what you want to be is a master. You want to master a subject. We can talk about this. You want to have mastery over a subject, right? Which is ridiculous. Nobody has a mastery over a subject. You don't have mastery over a subject. And if you think that you do, then you're going to teach students something that's just not true. It means that you trivialize your subject. Your students need to see that you cannot see it all, that when you study, you are still wondering, you're still being drawn deeper and deeper into texts, into images. In every field, there are principles that you don't understand. In numbers, there are things at work that you don't quite understand. They're mysterious and they're wonderful, and you don't quite get them. And that's a wonderful thing, not a terrible thing. This idea of not containing not containing the imaginative can have lots of different implications. I really can only speak out of my own experience. I think for me, this looks like humor. Refusing to allow seriousness to dominate every moment of my life, which I think is a tendency that can never work. Frankly, I think playing with language, I think puns is a wonderful way of being imaginative all the time, of realizing that words can be messed with a lot, and it's fun, and it's funny. And sometimes I think when I'm trying to be humorous, what I'm really saying is, at serious moments too. I sometimes worry that people are thinking I'm a jerk because I'm laughing at this terrible, absurd things are happening. But for me, sometimes when I'm laughing, what I'm really saying is that what I've just learned and discovered and had experienced, this is not all that is at work here. That there are meanings and there are agents that we can recognize that are casting and recasting this moment in eternity. The use of imagination in this way is leisurely. It's also the practice of rest. It makes us vulnerable, but it should revive our spirit.